Hello to all lovers of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious. If you enjoy stories that send chills down your spine and keep you awake at night, get ready, because this one, oh yes, this one is truly something else. The stories. This lakeside pier hides something no one reports. Lodge crews in the region still talk about an old pier tucked behind a quiet lake that draws almost no visitors. They say the pier looks normal from a distance, yet people keep finding strange evidence near its end that never reaches public reports. In the summer of 2019, a maintenance worker named Rylan Keating drove out to that lake for a simple task. He was 29 and worked routine grounds jobs for a small county crew. That day, he only needed to replace a warped board along the outer section of the pier. He liked the lake because it stayed calm even during busy seasons, and he figured the job would be quick enough to finish before lunch. When he parked near the tree line, he noticed the lot was empty, which felt odd because anglers usually arrived before dawn. The air felt thick, and the water looked darker than usual, yet he kept moving because the repair order had been waiting all week. He set his toolbox near the first post, then started walking along the pier to check for softboards before carrying supplies to the far section. Halfway across, he heard a short knock against the underside of the pier, which he assumed came from drifting debris. He leaned over the edge to look for logs, but saw nothing moving. The sound happened again, just 2 boards ahead, and this time he felt a faint vibration under his boots. He stepped back and tried to decide if the pier was shifting because of wind, but the lake's surface stayed flat without any waves. He reached the final stretch where the railing changed from new planks to older, weathered pieces. A notebook sat against the inner corner near the last post, which made him freeze because the crew did not store items out there. The notebook looked soaked along the edges, and several pages had stuck together. He picked it up and flipped through the front until he found a name that he did not recognize. The entry mentioned fishing conditions from early spring and included a rough drawing of the lake that ended with a short line stating the water felt wrong that day. He set the notebook down and crouched to check the damaged board that needed replacing. When he pulled the old plank free, he spotted a small metal badge wedged between the beams. It had no markings other than deep scratch lines that looked deliberate. The badge felt cold and heavy despite the warm morning air. He wiped away dirt, then placed it inside his shirt pocket because he wanted to check county records later. Rylan returned to his truck for the replacement board and felt uneasy during the walk back because the knocking sound continued at irregular intervals. When he reached the trunk, he noticed mud streaks on his rear bumper that did not match his earlier tracks. The streaks started near the center, then curved down toward the gravel, as if someone had leaned against the vehicle. He looked around the empty lot and called out asking if anyone needed help. No answer came back. He carried the new plank to the end of the pier and installed it quickly because he wanted to leave. While tightening the final screw, he heard a voice from the tree line near the far side of the lake. The words were hard to understand, yet the tone sounded urgent. He turned and scanned the shoreline, but saw no movement except for a faint ripple near the reeds. He stood still and waited for another sound, then heard what he thought was the same voice repeating a short phrase. The wind picked up, which carried the sound across the water in a strange pattern that made it difficult to pinpoint the source. He packed his tools and walked back toward the lot. Before reaching the shore, he noticed footprints near the first post that looked fresh. They were smaller than his boots and pressed deeply into the wood, which suggested someone had been standing there minutes earlier. He followed the prints for a short distance until they looped back toward the reeds and stopped abruptly where the boards felt damp. When Rylan returned to the office, he turned in the repair report and mentioned the found notebook and badge. His supervisor asked him to set both items on a side shelf until someone from records could examine them. That afternoon, the supervisor checked archival calls for that area and found references to an unconfirmed missing angler from early spring. The angler had signed in at the visitor kiosk but never signed out. Crews searched the lake for 2 days, then scaled back when no solid evidence surfaced. Later that week, Rylan decided to look deeper into the notebook. He flipped through more pages and discovered entries describing odd pressure changes near the pier on quiet days. One entry detailed a single ripple moving against the wind and stopping precisely under the pier. Another entry described faint tapping at night that sounded mechanical. None of the entries suggested danger, but the tone shifted in the final pages as the writer mentioned seeing a person standing near the reeds who vanished before he could wave. Rylan checked weather logs for the period mentioned in the notebook and noted a rare drop in barometric pressure that occurred without a storm. He also examined an old photo stored in his phone from a visit months earlier. In the photo, the lake looked normal, yet a small shape near the reeds reflected more light than surrounding water. He zoomed in and noticed a faint outline that resembled a shoulder above the surface. He thought it might be a lighting artifact, but decided to keep the image for reference. A week later, he returned to the lake with a coworker named Laramie Downs, who handled safety inspections. Laramie was older with years of field experience and usually dismissed odd reports, yet she agreed to help because she remembered the missing angler case. They arrived early and walked the length of the pier while checking for structural issues. Laramie tapped each beam with a small tool to test for hollow spots. When she reached the section where Rylan had found the badge, she paused because the sound changed. The beam gave a dull response, like something heavy sat under the structure. Rylan lay flat on the boards and lowered his arm to feel beneath the edge. His fingers touched a cold object that felt like metal. He reached further and pulled out a thin plate with holes drilled along one side. It looked like part of an old sonar bracket, but the lake had no recorded installations. Laramie suggested checking old maintenance logs from 2005 because the county once considered adding depth sensors for safety. She also noted the plate looked corroded only on one half, which indicated it had been partially shielded from water for a long time. They carried the plate to the truck and decided to walk the shoreline before leaving. Near the reeds, they found a small indentation in the mud that resembled a knee print next to a flattened patch of grass. The mark faced the lake as if someone had been kneeling to look at something. Laramie pointed out faint parallel lines near the water, which looked like drag marks. She photographed the area, then flagged it for a follow-up survey. Back at the office, Rylan compared the bracket plate with old schematics from a short-lived depth monitoring trial. He found a drawing showing 2 test brackets installed near the pier before the project was canceled. The logs stated the devices were removed after several malfunctions, but the final report accounted for only 1 bracket. The missing bracket had apparently fallen into the lake or been removed without documentation. The scratch lines on the badge matched the spacing of the holes on the plate, which suggested they had been stored or moved together at some point. Rylan checked weather sensors near the lake for unusual readings over the past year. Several early morning reports showed sharp changes in water temperature near the pier despite stable air conditions. He also found a dispatch log from late spring describing a caller who reported seeing a person waving near the reeds before disappearing under the surface. Responders searched but found no footprints and concluded the caller may have seen a bird landing. One night, Rylan returned to the lake alone because he wanted to verify something noted in the notebook. He walked to the end of the pier and stood still, listening for tapping. The lake stayed quiet until a single knock sounded beneath the beams exactly where he had felt vibration weeks earlier. He crouched and waited, then heard a softer knock that echoed against the metal bracket he had removed. He realized the sound pattern resembled the rhythm of small waves hitting a barrier, which made little sense in calm water. He shined a flashlight into the gap where the bracket had been and saw a narrow space that opened into a small cavity under the pier. Something metallic glinted near the back wall. He reached with a long rod and pulled out a rusted hinge attached to a bent bar. The pieces looked like remnants of an improvised tool. He placed the hinge on the deck, then noticed a wet footprint forming near the end post. The shape appeared in seconds, as if someone had stepped there recently. The board around it stayed dry while the footprint darkened. Rylan backed away slowly and pointed the light at the tree line. Nothing moved, and the air stayed silent. He waited for the footprint to fade, but it held shape for several minutes before drying unevenly. He documented the scene with his phone, then left the lake without waiting for more signs. Weeks later, the county closed the pier for extended maintenance and sealed the logs from public access. The missing angler case remained unresolved, yet several notes were added stating unexplained structural anomalies had been found near the outer section. Rylan kept copies of the notebook entries and the photo of the bright shoulder shape. He never returned to the lake, but told coworkers the pier held a mix of forgotten equipment and quiet warnings that did not reach official channels. He believed the clues pointed to someone spending secret time under the structure long before the angler disappeared. He also believed the knocking he heard came from shifting metal against trapped beams rather than anything mystical. Still, the unexplained footprint remained the detail he never understood. Today, the lake sits quiet behind dense trees, and the pier shows new boards that look identical to the old ones. Locals say nothing strange happens there anymore, and officials agree. Ryland thinks the place carries its own quiet trail of missed signs, and he hopes they stay buried where they cause no more stories. The stories. Never take the shortcut behind the closed factory. The old shortcut behind the closed factory had a reputation that reportedly dated back to the early 2000s. Local reports described strange audio picked up by nearby delivery cameras during quiet nights when almost no one walked there. A worker named Lyron Strayed, who was 34 and handled maintenance jobs across small industrial sites, first heard those claims during a routine shift. He did not care much because his focus that day was finishing a late repair, then getting home before midnight. His route usually stayed along the main road, which felt safer and better lit. That changed when a dispatcher called near the end of his shift and asked for a quick check on a generator that kept tripping alarms. The generator sat near the old factory's fence line, which meant he had to park close to the edge of the blocked shortcut. He grabbed his tool bag and walked toward the unit while thinking about the shortcut stories he had ignored for years. The generator itself looked fine, though the alarm reset kept glitching in a way that suggested a loose internal relay. Lyron unscrewed the panel and ran a simple line test, which showed steady current without major issues. He decided the alarm might be reacting to stray interference from another unit placed years earlier near the empty factory. He stepped around the corner to inspect the older unit and noticed something unusual on the dirt path behind the fence. Fresh tire marks cut through the narrow corridor that was supposed to be locked and unused. He checked the fence and found the chain wrapped but not fully secured, like someone had looped it quickly without snapping the lock. Lyron returned to his truck for a small flashlight and snapped 2 photos of the fence for his report. He wanted to note it in case building management had missed scheduled security checks. When he stepped back toward the generator, his radio crackled with a faint, distorted signal that did not match the dispatch channel he normally heard. He held the radio higher and listened as the interference grew stronger. A voice whispered a short phrase that sounded like an address fragment, though the last part cut out sharply. He checked his phone to compare signal strength, yet noticed a timestamp glitch on his call log that he had never seen before. He documented that odd timestamp with another photo, then continued to follow the tire tracks just far enough to understand their direction. They ran straight toward a collapsed loading ramp behind the factory that had not been accessed since a structural inspection during 1999. The ground around the ramp looked disturbed, like heavy weight had pressed into softened soil. He decided to notify dispatch from his truck, but his radio remained unstable even after he switched frequencies twice. A high-pitched tone hit suddenly, forcing him to hold the device farther from his ear. When the tone stopped, the radio returned to silence, and his screen lit with a brief recorded notification that did not belong to his model. Lyron scrolled through the message and found a short, archived clip that showed poor quality video from an unknown camera. The clip displayed the same loading ramp he had just examined. A figure moved across the screen, but disappeared mid-frame like the feed had dropped instantly. He drove closer to the edge of the shortcut and shut off his headlights to see the area better. The last street lamp flickered, producing uneven light over the ramp and fence. He kept his phone ready for an emergency call. He also reviewed his earlier photos because he wanted a clearer sense of the path shape before stepping near it again. Details he overlooked became clearer with a second look. The tire tracks overlapped an older set of boot prints that moved in the opposite direction toward the outer road. Those prints looked narrow and deep, like someone had walked quickly while carrying a heavy load. He checked the soil near his boots and found similar compression marks that matched the archived clip patterns almost exactly. He took more pictures and followed the tracks until he reached a corroded service door near the ramp. The door sat slightly open, though crews had sealed it with metal brackets during 2006. He pushed gently and felt resistance from warped hinges rather than any locking mechanism. Inside, the air smelled stale, and dust covered most surfaces. His light caught the outline of a forklift abandoned long ago, though the tire dust pattern suggested recent movement that did not match the machine's dead battery state. He lifted the engine cover briefly and saw untouched corrosion that proved the forklift had not operated recently, which made the tracks outside even stranger. Near the back wall, he found a stack of handwritten notes taped to a cabinet. The pages carried dates from the late 2000s and documented repeated complaints about unauthorized after-hours activity. One note mentioned an unidentified van entering through the same corridor that created the tire marks he saw. Another described auditory anomalies inside the building, captured by a security mic later removed during an equipment reduction. He copied the notes by taking photos and moved to the other end of the room where a damaged camera hung loose. The camera's data card remained inside, though the casing had cracked. He removed the card carefully and placed it inside an evidence pouch he kept for documenting property damage. The pouch kept dust-off sensitive parts, which might help tech staff recover something useful. When he stepped outside again, he noticed the street lamp flickering faster. A shadow crossed the ramp area, though no one appeared nearby. He raised his flashlight and scanned slowly until the beam caught a piece of torn reflective tape stuck to the fence. The tape matched a style used by highway crews in the early 2000s and had similar aging patterns to tape visible in the archived clip. He returned to his truck to call dispatch again and finally reached a stable connection. The dispatcher listened, then pulled up two old maintenance logs that referenced unusual trespassing during night shifts between 2003 and 2008. Those logs mentioned a possible smuggling route using the service door before the factory closed. The route was believed sealed after the inspection in 2006, but no follow-up confirmation existed. Lyron asked the dispatcher to check one more detail, specifically whether any recent patrol cars had reported activity near the shortcut. She checked and found a brief report from earlier that evening. A driver claimed he saw a van enter the far side of the blocked road, though no vehicle appeared on traffic cams afterward. He finished his call and walked back toward the generator to close his initial work order. The radio interference returned, but softer, almost like the earlier voice had weakened. He waited to see if anything else came through. Only a faint click repeated twice, matching the distortion pattern from the archived clip. Before leaving, he photographed the loading ramp again, along with the surrounding soil. When he reviewed the new images, he saw a fresh indentation near the forklift room entrance, as if someone or something had stepped there after he exited. The shape looked too narrow for a normal boot, but aligned perfectly with the print glimpse seen in the archived clip. He left the site carefully and locked the outer gate before sending all photos and the data card to the tech department. He then wrote a detailed report describing each anomaly exactly as he observed it. His findings matched older complaints closely, creating a pattern that suggested someone had been using the closed corridor long after the factory shut down. The next morning, the tech team confirmed the data card contained partial footage from 2 nights earlier that showed the same shadow crossing the loading ramp. They also discovered faint audio that matched the strange voice Lyron heard through his radio. It repeated the same clipped address fragment that had confused him near the generator. Investigators later checked that fragment and found it corresponded to an unregistered storage lot once connected to the factory by a freight contract during the late 1990s. The lot had changed ownership several times without clear documentation, which explained why no record connected it to the shortcut corridor anymore. Lyron stayed involved through follow-up calls for several weeks. His report became part of a larger inquiry into abandoned freight routes that still carried untracked activity. The case remained unofficial because none of the evidence pointed to a clear suspect or purpose. It only showed movement that had restarted for unknown reasons. He sometimes drove past the site after work and noticed the city had installed better locks and stronger lights. The shortcut no longer flickered with the eerie randomness that greeted him that night. He never again heard the distorted voice or saw odd timestamps on his radio displays. The experience left him cautious about places that looked abandoned but still carried signs of movement. He understood how easily someone could miss tiny clues unless the light hit them at the right angle. Every tire, track, shadow, and flicker had pointed to something real that operated quietly in the gaps between forgotten structures. He still thinks about the warning he heard from older workers who told him to avoid that corridor. Their stories felt exaggerated back then, yet the evidence he gathered proved there was always something strange behind the closed factory. The stories. The mineshaft everyone avoids after one winter shift. Hushed stories about a troubled winter shift lingered around an old mining town where people rarely challenged its harsh land. Locals claimed the trouble began after a night when a minor accident exposed something deeper than ice inside an abandoned shaft. Ryder Halden was 34 and worked as a maintenance tech for a small mining contractor that handled seasonal repairs. He arrived in the area during early winter to inspect older ventilation lines after a storm damaged several service roads. He hoped to finish his tasks fast because he planned to drive south before deeper snow arrived. His simple goal was to check the inactive shaft called Northcut and file a routine report that usually required little effort. The incident started when Ryder reached the frozen service trail and noticed fresh tire marks that did not match company vehicles. He studied the tracks because they curved sharply near the locked entrance, and he felt annoyed since trespassing caused delays. He followed the marks for a short distance and found the company padlock on the gate sitting open in the snow. That immediately changed his plan because an unlocked gate meant he needed to walk inside and confirm that no one had entered recently. The complication grew once he stepped into the dim first chamber and heard a steady tapping sound echoing from deeper tunnels. Ryder paused because the mine had been inactive for more than 10 years, according to archived maintenance logs stored in the base office. He tried to convince himself that melting ice caused the noise, yet the tapping kept a slow rhythm that felt intentional. Nearby walls held old chalk markings that matched diagrams found in earlier reports, though he spotted one new line that seemed recently drawn. He documented the finding with his work phone because unusual markings required clear evidence for supervisors. The photo captured a faint boot print beside the chalk line, and that raised his concern further. Ryder checked the archived inspection sheets stored on the local server earlier that morning, and none mentioned any recent site visits other than his. He decided to walk deeper because standard protocol ordered a full sweep whenever unauthorized signs appeared. He carried a small lantern since the wired lights no longer functioned after their power source was removed several years prior. During his investigation, he followed the tapping while keeping his pace slow, and he noticed the pattern shift whenever he stopped moving. Ryder wondered if frozen beams strained under winter pressure, yet the sound seemed too controlled to match structural stress. The tunnel floor held dusty rail tracks once used for small carts, and he saw scattered debris that did not appear in previous photos taken during a 2018 inspection. Among the pieces, he noticed a bent metal badge with faded lettering that seemed older than the shutdown date. He recorded its location because older equipment sometimes surfaced during thaw periods, and supervisors liked accurate notes. The tapping finally ceased near a narrow drop that led to a secondary shaft called split turn, according to age diagrams. Ryder checked archived calls from the company emergency line on his tablet because the area once hosted minor cave-ins, and he found one brief report from 2009 that mentioned a missing day laborer whose case ended without clear closure. The record did not list a name, and Ryder assumed it was a typical incomplete file from seasonal hiring cycles. Still, the timing of the tapping felt too strange and forced him to rethink his assumptions about the site. He crouched near the drop and shined his lantern downward, where he spotted a small fabric scrap wedged between two beams. The scrap looked newer than the surrounding decay, and he recognized the color because it matched safety jackets issued during recent winter shifts at the company depot. Ryder felt uneasy because no crew members reported missing gear that month, and the depot logs showed no issued jackets beyond standard signouts. He reached for the scrap carefully and noticed dried dirt on its underside, along with faint char marks that resembled contact with a heated surface. As he studied the scrap, a distant metallic clang echoed from behind him, which made him turn quickly. Ryder called out for any possible trespasser, and his voice bounced through the tunnels without a reply. He replayed earlier photos on his phone to compare debris positions, and he realized a thin wooden plank on the floor behind him now leaned at a sharper angle. He felt certain he did not touch it earlier, so he took another photo, planning to discuss it with security because possible movement indicated human presence or shifting beams. Ryder climbed out of the narrow section and moved toward the first chamber, using the lantern to check each corner. On the way, he discovered a shallow scrape on the wall that looked freshly made, and the chalky dust sat loose on the ground below it. He checked his steps carefully because he wanted to avoid contaminating the scene before proper documentation. He snapped a photo and noted its timestamp for supervisors, who required clear tracking of each entry detail. As he reached the first chamber, the cold air felt sharper and carried a faint burnt scent that had not been present earlier. Ryder scanned the floor for heat sources, but found only patches of frost that melted near the gate. He felt confused because the temperature should have dropped consistently inside an inactive shaft during winter storms. His attention returned to the open padlock because fresh scarring around its hinge suggested someone forced it quickly rather than using a key. He stepped outside and followed the tire tracks up the service trail. The sun hung low and gave the snow an orange tint that made details easier to spot. Ryder found a second set of prints beside the tire marks, which looked like boots with shallow tread, and the stride pattern suggested a slow walk. He recorded this because incidents involving unauthorized visitors required complete documentation for liability protection. The prints led toward a bend where the snow deepened around an old equipment shed with a cracked metal roof. At the shed, he found the door slightly ajar and signs of recent activity like disturbed dust and dragged footprints. Ryder pushed the door open and found a large portable heater tipped on its side with a melted patch around its vent. The heater model matched units removed from service years earlier due to overheating risks, and he knew they remained stored at a warehouse miles away. Ryder checked the shed floor and found more scraps of the same jacket material he collected earlier, which suggested a link to the heater incident. Tapping returned faintly from the direction of the mine, which forced him to choose between returning to safety or completing his sweep. He paused because protocol permitted retreat when structural risks arose, yet he believed the evidence required a clearer connection. Ryder replayed the metallic clang in his mind and concluded that the noise did not match natural stress shifts. He walked back toward the gate with steady steps while comparing earlier tire tracks to ensure no new marks appeared during his absence. Inside the chamber again, Ryder traced the tapping to a side tunnel sealed during the 2009 incident mentioned in archived calls. The seal consisted of old boards nailed across the tunnel mouth, yet one board sagged as if recently disturbed. He lifted his lantern and saw soot on the edges that resembled the heater melt pattern from the shed. Ryder removed gloves and checked the temperature of the soot but found it cold, which meant the disturbance happened earlier. Behind the boards, he noticed another chalk mark shaped like a short horizontal line above a circle. He tried to recall earlier diagrams and realized this symbol appeared in a forgotten annex report describing temporary holding zones used for equipment staging. Ryder removed a loose board and peered into the dark opening where he saw a narrow pit with metal fragments scattered along its base. Among them, he saw a torn patch of the same jacket color that seemed older with deeper dirt embedded in its fibers. He lowered his lantern deeper and noticed something else. A structural support beam bore a fresh dent shaped like the corner of a heater casing. He understood then that someone tried to use older gear to heat part of the tunnel, possibly to locate or free something buried under the pit. This linked the heater scrap, soot marks, and scorch on the jacket pieces into a single sequence, suggesting a recent search attempt. Ryder backed away because he realized the person or people involved might still be nearby. Before leaving, he noticed his lantern flicker and then regain strength. The tapping stopped again, which heightened his urgency. Ryder stepped out into the open trail and felt the frozen wind strike harder as he reached his truck. He contacted dispatch and requested a site lockdown due to signs of unauthorized entry and possible hazardous activity. Dispatch promised to send a team after sunrise, since travel remained dangerous during heavy winter. A follow-up investigation reportedly found additional heater fragments inside the shed, along with prints that matched no employees. Witness statements from nearby residents mentioned a person seen in a bright jacket entering the service trail 2 nights earlier. No one confirmed the identity, and footage from an old roadside camera offered only a blurred outline walking toward the gate. The pit area remained sealed after teams scanned it with ground sensors that detected minor voids but no confirmed remains or trapped equipment. Ryder later reviewed his photos and noted that the chalk symbol above the circle matched older maps that marked forgotten test zones unrelated to recorded accidents. Supervisors concluded that someone might have misinterpreted the old reports and attempted an unapproved search inside the shaft. They reinforced the gate and added warning signs that urged people to avoid the trail during winter shifts. To this day, the mineshaft remains closed, and locals still talk about the tapping that drifted through it that season. Ryder kept his notes stored on his tablet because he believed the sounds came from shifting beams rather than any hidden person. Yet he understood why others felt uneasy when passing that trail, especially when winter storms made the land crack and echo in unpredictable ways. The stories. What a hunter's dash cam caught before it went dark. Ranger files reportedly include a brief dash cam clip from a small county trail where a hunter vanished during a quiet winter morning. The footage circulated among local deputies for years, and some said it captured the last clear moment before everything went dark. Calder Rusk was a 39-year-old warehouse supervisor who hunted whitetail on weekends near an old service road outside a rural township. He liked the quiet routine because it reminded him of calm trips he took with his uncle during the late 1990s. On a cold morning in early 2017, he set out before sunrise with a simple goal to test a new trail camera he had mounted near a frozen creek. He drove a faded pickup with a budget dash cam that ran whenever the engine turned, and he kept it for insurance reasons. He headed toward the tree line under a pale sky and planned to reach his blind before other hunters scattered the deer. He parked near a thin cluster of spruce trees and noted the strange sound of distant engines that did not match the usual logging trucks. He stepped out, locked the truck, then grabbed a small pack that held water and a thermal layer. While crossing the first ridge, he heard a sharp crack from the lower creek bed that stopped him long enough to check for falling branches. He saw nothing moving through the frost and continued toward his blind with the plan to return by mid-afternoon. The trigger came when he noticed a line of prints that curved away from the creek with a stride that seemed too wide for any deer. He crouched and studied the marks, which looked oddly pressed, as if a heavy object had settled briefly before sliding forward. Witness statements from 2 hikers later confirmed a loud metallic scrape in that area around dawn. Calder followed the prints along a narrow stretch where the snow had thinned near a power cut. He took out his phone and snapped 3 photos, which appeared in the recovered data after his disappearance. In the first photo, his gloved hand pointed at a deep trough in the ice. In the second photo, a faint reflection hinted at a dull shape beneath the surface. In the third photo, the trail bent toward a thicket with sharp broken branches. Complications piled up when he reached the old blind and found the canvas flap torn along the side where he kept a small heater. He checked his gear, muttered that kids might have messed with it, then noticed the same strange prints circling the blind at least twice. A nearby birch trunk had a fresh gouge that lined with a rough metal edge rather than any animal claw. He reportedly radioed a friend named Orrin Dale around mid-morning and mentioned a set of tracks that looked artificial. Orrin later told deputies that Calder sounded tired but focused, which matched the timestamp on the dashcam file. The truck sat untouched all morning except for a brief moment when the wind pushed snow across the lens. Calder decided to hike toward the ridge above the old service road since the prints kept drifting uphill. While climbing, he spotted a rusted trail marker that had not been maintained since 2005, and he stopped long enough to compare the lower section with the strange gouge on his blind. The cuts matched in width and depth, which led him to believe someone had been dragging old equipment through the property. He continued over the ridge and entered a narrow pass where discarded fencing lay half buried under ice. He bent to check a twisted strand and noticed faint smudges that looked like dried hydraulic fluid. The smell was faint but distinct, which suggested a leaking machine had passed through at some point during the previous night. He recorded a short voice note on his phone saying he planned to follow the trail until noon. Deputies later found that note in the recovered cloud folder, which helped build a basic timeline. According to weather logs, the wind picked up around midday and the ridge became unstable. Forest crews said a section of the old pass sometimes shifted during heavy gusts, which caused minor slides that could trap a person in loose snow. Yet something in the final dashcam clip suggested a different angle. By early afternoon, Calder returned to his truck, but he looked unsettled. The dashcam captured him walking from the tree line with quick, heavy steps while glancing over his shoulder. He opened the door, tossed his pack onto the passenger seat, then leaned inside while breathing hard. A faint metallic clatter echoed from the ridge, which made him freeze for 5 full seconds. He whispered, "That was not a deer," then climbed in and started the engine. The camera angle showed his eyes tracking something moving between the trees. Snow drifted across the hood while a light creak came from behind the truck. The sound repeated twice with a rising pitch that made him tense his shoulders before shifting into reverse. He backed a few feet, paused, then pulled forward, as if unsure which direction offered safety. His hands shook on the wheel and he muttered, "Come on," while trying to scan the tree line. The camera struggled to focus because frost built on the windshield, yet a brief silhouette appeared to the right. The shape seemed tall, with a narrow top that tapered toward the ground. Officials never confirmed that detail, though. Several deputies mentioned the silhouette in informal notes preserved in the archived case file. The shape moved once, then vanished when the camera auto-adjusted. Calder shifted again and chose the narrow path back toward the main road. His breathing slowed, but he kept glancing at the rear mirror as if tracking invisible movement. 20 seconds before the file ended, the truck lurched violently to the left, which knocked the camera sideways. A burst of static filled the audio and a heavy thud landed somewhere near the rear bumper. Calder shouted, "Hey, stop!" Then the camera caught a slanted view of the ridge, where a dark form slid under the branches. Snow showered the hood as he pressed the accelerator in panic. The final clear frame showed a long scrape running across the truck bed, which matched the gouge found on his blind. Investigators believed something metallic struck the truck during that moment, although no working equipment was ever logged on that road. The clip ended when the camera lost power due to a damaged cable that had been cleanly severed. Calder Rusk was reported missing the next morning when he failed to show for a shift at the warehouse. Search teams found his truck stuck in a shallow drift about a mile from the service road. Tracks around the vehicle were distorted by wind, though one responder noted a long impression shaped like a flattened cylinder that matched the strange prints seen near the creek. Despite a wide search, no clear evidence explained what he chased or what followed him down the ridge that day. Rangers later concluded that unstable terrain and poor visibility likely contributed to his disappearance. They preserved the dashcam clip because the strange sounds and the silhouette raised questions they could not fully answer. Years later, locals still talk about the footage that flickered for a few seconds before going dark. Some point to old reports of scrap equipment dumped along the ridge, while others mention odd engine noises heard during cold mornings. Whatever happened that day seemed tied to the silent shape moving through the trees as Calder rushed back to his truck. The story now serves as a quiet warning for anyone who hikes beyond that old service road. People say the trail feels different after heavy snow, and the ridges shift without warning. The clip remains the only known record of what a single hunter found before everything faded into static and winter silence. The stories. What's buried beneath that motel parking lot? In 2013, a small highway motel outside a rural town gained quiet attention after workers found strange soil layers under fresh asphalt. The case never reached headlines, but locals still mention it when strange noises come from the empty lot at night. The story centers on Rylan Mercer, who was 29 and worked as a nighttime maintenance tech at the old roadside place. He lived in a small room near the supply shed and handled plumbing issues plus late check-ins during slow months. On a chilly night in early autumn, he planned to replace worn bulbs along the back walkway before closing the service desk. He walked out toward the alley where the lot met a row of overgrown trees that blocked wind from the highway. He carried a small tool bag and wanted to finish the job before storms reached the ridge. He heard gravel shift under a passing truck but ignored it and kept moving toward the flickering lights. The first incident happened when he tried to pull a ladder from storage and felt the ground dip under his feet with a dull cracking sound. He stepped back fast because the asphalt felt soft in one oddly shaped patch near an older drainage grate. He knelt with caution and pushed a screwdriver into the crack, but found soil that felt looser than normal fill. Rylan went inside and wrote a brief note about the issue, because the motel owner wanted records of every minor repair. He grabbed a flashlight and returned outside to check the area again, since guests sometimes reported old pipes vibrating under the lot. He pressed his heel against the weakened spot and felt a faint vibration that did not match normal pipe flow. The complication grew after he asked an older guest named Hollis Grant if he had heard unusual sounds during his stay. Hollis said he heard steady tapping under the pavement around midnight 2 nights earlier. He said the tapping felt rhythmic in a slow pattern that reminded him of someone knocking through thin wood. Rylan wrote the detail in his small notebook because he wanted a full record for the owner. The next morning, he looked at archived maintenance logs stored in a dusty drawer near the office printer. He found an entry from 2009 that noted settling issues under the same section of the lot without any follow-up record. The note simply said that workers filled a shallow dip with recycled asphalt after heavy rain, but never investigated deeper layers. He walked back outside and scraped away loose chunks of pavement until he reached a thin patch of older concrete mixed with cracked gravel. He noticed faint marks in the old material that looked like parallel lines spaced evenly in a pattern similar to a box lid. He pushed his flashlight beam through the cracks and saw a dark void below the thin concrete sheet. Rylan called his friend Linton Fry, who worked part-time with a local cleanup crew that handled abandoned structures. Linton arrived after lunch and helped test the hollow area with a short steel rod used for soil checks. The rod dropped several inches into the void and produced a hollow thump that sounded too sharp for natural erosion pockets. Rylan felt uneasy but wanted clear evidence before alerting the owner. They cut a small square in the weakened concrete using an old rotary tool from the supply shed. Dust scattered across gravel as the square lifted with surprising ease. Underneath was compacted dirt mixed with thin scraps of plastic that looked melted by heat. Rylan reached in and pulled out a small strip with faded printing that looked like part of a safety warning from older storage bins. The deeper investigation started when Rylan found an old photo taped inside the maintenance log he borrowed from 2009. The photo showed the lot before renovations in 2006 and included a small storage cabin that no longer existed. A handwritten note on the back said the cabin caught fire during a storm, but details were never shared with newer staff. Rylan asked the owner about it, but only received a quiet answer that the cabin was removed after a minor electrical issue. Rylan then checked archive dispatch logs stored at the county library and found a brief call from July 2006 that reported a small fire near a roadside property matching the motel's mile marker. The call mentioned unknown materials stored inside an abandoned cabin that smoldered before firefighters cleared debris. No injuries were reported, but the log said a chemical odor lingered during the cleanup. He returned to the void under the lot and dug deeper with a small garden trowel he kept for landscaping tasks. 2 inches down, he uncovered brittle wood fibers coated in a hardened black residue that smelled faintly metallic. Linton suggested the residue looked similar to burned plastic from older industrial crates. They kept digging until the trowel struck a thin metal edge shaped like a corner bracket. They widened the hole and exposed a rectangular metal frame with charred wood inside, almost like a collapsed storage box left under the ground during repaving. Rylan found a faded barcode sticker fused to the metal, but the numbers were unreadable, except for the last 3 digits, which appeared as 416. He checked supplier records from the motel office and saw older inventory tags that used long strings, ending with the same 3 digits. The tags belonged to a discontinued supplier that shipped chemical cleaning agents in reinforced boxes. The twist came when Rylan realized the rhythmic tapping reported by Hollis might connect to shifting air pockets trapped under warped metal panels. He tested the theory by placing a board over the hollow section and stepping on different spots. Each step produced a soft knock from moving metal that echoed through the buried frame. The tapping was not from a person, but from trapped panels flexing after years of underground corrosion. He called the motel owner again with all findings and explained that the lot might contain remnants of a burned supply cabin that crews buried instead of removing fully during renovations. The owner sighed and admitted he purchased the property after the fire and assumed everything had been cleared by the previous crew. He agreed to bring in a licensed team to remove remaining material. When the cleanup team started work, they found several melted storage boxes that had fused together during the 2006 fire. The boxes contained expired solvent containers that ruptured during heat exposure. Crews confirmed the ash smell came from plastic and wood that settled unevenly under asphalt after the rushed renovation. They transported the debris to a proper disposal site and filled the cavity with stable soil. After workers repaired the pavement, Rylan walked the lot at dusk and listened for any sign of hidden noise. The tapping had stopped, and the ground felt firm under every step. He wrote a final note describing the discovery and placed it with other logs so future staff could understand the history. People still mention the motel when storms roll across the ridge because the lot glistens strangely after heavy rain. Rylan thinks the glimmer comes from newer asphalt mixing with old gravel, but he also knows that memories of buried things often linger longer than anyone expects. He told Linton the mystery felt smaller once evidence replaced fear, and Linton agreed as they locked the shed and watched distant trucks roll past on the quiet highway. The stories. Why the police sealed off this roadside chapel. The small roadside chapel sat near a quiet county highway where drivers sometimes stopped during long rural trips. Local deputies reportedly closed it in late 2019 after a traveler found something that changed the tone around the place. The building was simple, and people usually barely noticed it. The story centered on a 34-year-old maintenance surveyor named Corbin Hale, who often drove that route for work. He lived in a nearby town, and he usually kept to a steady schedule that involved checking rural drainage markers along the highway. On a mild afternoon in late September of that year, he planned to finish early so he could meet a friend for dinner. He stopped near the chapel because one of the markers behind it looked slanted, and he wanted to document it. He walked toward the spot while carrying a small camera and a work notebook. The chapel door stood slightly open, and he remembered hearing nothing except distant traffic. He planned to ignore the building until he heard a short tapping sound from inside. The sound made him pause, and he stepped closer to check if someone needed help. He called out a quick greeting but got no answer, which felt strange considering the soft tapping kept going. He pushed the door with his boot and saw dust drifting through a bright slant of late daylight. A wooden bench near the front looked recently moved because its legs scraped fresh lines across the floor. The tapping came from deeper inside the room, which held only simple furniture and a small cross fixed above a shelf. Corbin noticed a backpack sitting beside the far wall, which did not belong to anyone he had seen earlier. He stepped in and recorded a short clip on his camera to document the scene. The tapping stopped once he moved toward the backpack. He felt uneasy, which he later described in a written statement to deputies. He returned outside and found a driver who had pulled over to check a map. That driver, named Rhea Dunford, told police she had been there roughly 10 minutes and saw no one enter or exit the chapel. She agreed to wait while Corbin called the non-emergency line to report an unattended bag because he worried about possible travelers who might need help. Deputies arrived 20 minutes later, according to their logs, and inspected the chapel with measured caution. Inside the bag, they found a wallet and an old flip phone plus a folded printed photo of the chapel. The photo looked like it had been taken years earlier because the paint on the door in that image was a different shade. The wallet held no cards, and the phone battery was nearly dead, but it powered on long enough for one deputy to see 3 saved video clips. Those clips showed brief shots of the chapel interior taken during different seasons, which suggested someone had visited repeatedly. In each clip, a bench had been moved to a different spot, and in the final clip, a faint figure appeared reflected in the small window which faced the highway. Deputies later said the figure looked like a person crouched near the bench, though the image lacked clarity. Investigators reviewed old repair records for the chapel, which belonged to a small regional trust that handled forgotten roadside structures built decades earlier. The trust produced a file showing a volunteer caretaker named Myron Keats, who went missing in early 2009 during a routine supply run. His last note mentioned stopping at the chapel to drop off paint. No clear link existed between his disappearance and the backpack, except the printed photo which matched the photography style in a few older trust documents. Investigators searched local archives for any reported visits after his disappearance and found a single entry in 2015 from a driver who claimed to see a man moving a bench inside at dusk. That report named no suspect, and the driver never returned follow-up calls. Deputies used the phone clips to frame their timeline and interviewed residents who passed through the area before the chapel closure. One witness, named Avery Lorne, recalled seeing a tired-looking man near the highway in early 2017 carrying what seemed like paint supplies. She described him as quiet and focused on the chapel path. Her statement matched the trust note, which strengthened the idea that someone remained connected to the building for years. Investigators also compared the fresh scrape marks on the floor with older photos taken by trust volunteers. Those older photos showed the bench in fixed positions, which suggested someone had moved it repeatedly in recent months. This supported the idea that the visitor returned long after Myron disappeared. When they completed their review, they sealed the chapel for safety because they believed an unknown person had been sheltering there. The person possibly struggled with memory issues or untreated fear of being found, according to one unofficial summary shared with Corbin. They suspected the tapping sound came from the bench shifting under slight pressure, which fit with his description. The unknown visitor was never located, and no missing person report perfectly matched the wallet photo, though the style resembled a younger Myron. Authorities kept the case open, but treated it as a possible long-term wandering situation rather than foul play. Corbin later told friends that the chapel felt different when he drove past on later surveys. He thought about the way small, forgotten places can hold tangled stories that no one fully understands. He believed the closure made sense because it protected whoever might return, as well as anyone who stopped without knowing the hidden history. He still remembered the tapping sound and considered it a reminder that quiet places often carry quiet warnings. The stories. The bus route no driver volunteers for anymore. Mason Kiernan had heard about Route 74 from older drivers who spoke in quiet tones that never carried far. They said the trouble started in the late 2010s after a strange series of reports reached dispatch. Nothing dramatic was proven, yet every account shared the same route and the same stretch of road. Mason was 34 with 6 years on the job, and he handled his shifts without much worry. He covered suburban loops near a quiet industrial strip, and most days followed a predictable pattern. He enjoyed the routine since it felt steady and harmless. When his supervisor asked him to cover Route 74 one cloudy afternoon, he agreed before he remembered the warnings. He showed up early at the depot that day, hoping to review the old logbooks stored in a dusty metal drawer near the operations office. The previous drivers had left short notes that felt rushed and uneasy. One entry from late 2016 mentioned a recorded thump on the rear exterior panel that matched no visible damage. Another entry filed in early 2018 reported an unknown passenger leaving muddy prints that ended halfway down the aisle. Mason drove out a little before 4 that afternoon. The route crossed through residential blocks before curving toward the old mill road that ran along an abandoned railway cut. He planned to complete the loop without focusing on the rumors. The bus felt solid, and the passengers were few. A pair of teenagers sat near the middle seats while an elderly man checked his phone with slow movements. The incident started as Mason merged onto the mill road. His side mirror reflected something darker than the usual late daylight. He caught a shape near the tree line that looked like a person leaning slightly forward. When he blinked, the shape was gone. He told himself it was nothing unusual, since shadows often stretched strangely near wooded areas. Still, he noticed the elderly man glancing toward the same window, as if he had sensed something too. A mile later, the teenagers hit the stop cord. Mason opened the doors, and they stepped out onto a fading concrete pad. As the doors shut, one of them tapped the glass and pointed toward the rear of the bus. Mason reversed the angle of his mirror and saw a smear across the lower panel. It looked wet, like someone dragged a hand along the metal. He checked the road behind him and saw no one there. The teenagers shrugged before walking away. Mason continued toward the loop turn, focusing on the sound of the engine. The noise seemed slightly off-pitch. He kept his speed steady, but sensed a weight shift near the rear section. The elderly passenger moved closer and asked if everything was all right. Mason told him the engine felt warm but stable. The man nodded and mentioned hearing a hollow tapping near the back wall. At the final stop of the loop, the elderly man stepped out, leaving Mason alone for the return run. He checked the exterior panel and found the smear dry like dust pressed by a damp glove. The shape continued a few inches beyond the edge, as if the contact started slightly off the surface. He wiped it with his sleeve and felt grainy residue flake away with an odd metallic smell. He climbed back inside and started the engine. The interior lights flickered once as the gear engaged. He made it halfway up the hill before a heavy thud sounded near the emergency exit. He braked and listened. Another softer thud followed, like something shifting its weight. He walked down the aisle with slow steps and checked each row. The seats were empty, and the air felt colder than it should for that hour. Near the back seat, he noticed a set of partial prints on the floor. They were narrower than a normal shoe, but shaped like someone walking with uneven pressure. The prints stopped exactly where previous notes claimed they ended. He crouched low and found a fragment of dried soil that did not match the usual clay from the area. It held a reddish tint closer to iron dust from the old mill yard. Mason reached dispatch through the radio and reported the noises. The operator told him to return the bus for inspection, since archived calls from earlier years mentioned similar sounds. He kept the radio open as he returned to the wheel. The air inside felt charged, like static gathering before a storm. On the way back, he passed the same hill where he had seen the shadow near the trees. The mirror caught movement again. This time, he saw a figure standing perfectly still on the narrow shoulder. The figure wore something loose that blended with the background. The face seemed pale, though he could not see details clearly. The figure vanished between glances without any sign of retreat. A minute later, a faint tapping started along the rear exterior. It rose in 3 short bursts that matched a steady rhythm. He recognized a pattern similar to someone hitting metal to test thickness. He held the wheel tight and kept driving until the depot gates came into view. Mechanics met him near the garage. They checked the exterior and found thin scratches near the rear panel that shaped a curved line not caused by branches. The residue he had wiped earlier fell into a small tray and produced a metallic odor stronger than before. One mechanic mentioned that earlier logs described identical residue after drivers reported seeing a lone figure near the mill road in late 2017. The supervisor asked Mason to retrace the interior for any objects left behind. He searched each row with a handheld light. Near the same spot where the prints ended, he found a torn strip of cloth hanging from the seat frame. It felt oddly cold, even under the warm light. The cloth carried the same reddish tint as the soil fragment. Later that night, the depot reviewed old dash recordings from previous years. Most footage showed nothing more than faint reflections. However, one clip from mid-2019 captured a blurred outline moving along the side of a passing bus. The outline kept pace for several seconds before fading near the same hill where Mason saw the figure. Investigators compared the footage with archived local reports. They found mention of a worker who disappeared near the mill site in late 2015. The report never confirmed foul play, and the search ended without results. There was no official link connecting that case to the strange events on the route, yet the timing matched the earliest driver notes. Mason stayed quiet as the supervisor reviewed the findings. The bus still sat idling with a low rumble that hummed through the concrete floor. A mechanic tapped the rear panel and noted that the metal vibrated oddly like a surface recently struck from the outside. Another mechanic mentioned hearing a faint echo that felt delayed by half a second. The depot decided to suspend Route 74 until the buses could be tested. Drivers whispered that the figure near the hill might be tied to the worker who vanished years earlier. No one claimed solid proof, yet the pattern of sightings, sounds, and residue lined up too closely to ignore. The supervisor circulated a memo explaining that the route posed operational risks due to repeated, unexplained interference. Mason drove home that night feeling the weight of everything he had seen. He replayed the moment when the figure appeared in the mirror. He tried to decide if it looked like a person seeking help or a shape formed by shifting shadows. The cloth fragment still felt cold in his memory, though he never touched it again. In the weeks after the suspension, several commuters asked why the route closed. Officials told them the road required maintenance due to instability near the railway cut. Only a few people mentioned the old rumors. Some said they once saw someone walking the hill at dusk, though none described a clear face. Mason returned to his regular loop and kept his focus on safe runs. He never requested Route 74 again. Whenever the topic surfaced among drivers, he listened quietly without adding his story. He knew what he had heard and seen on that road. He also knew that the evidence, while thin, repeated across years with unsettling consistency. The depot finally retired the buses assigned to that route. They stored them in a corner lot away from the main garage. On calm nights, staff claimed to hear soft taps on the panels as if something moved inside the old shells. No one investigated because the sound stopped whenever a door opened. Each time Mason passed the lot, he felt a chill rise along his arms. He believed the events were real, even if no official report could confirm them. Route 74 remained closed, and no driver stepped forward to revive it. The story faded from public view, yet those who worked at the depot understood why the route stayed empty. They remembered how it felt to sense a presence following the bus, and they knew some roads carry histories that never fully settle. The stories. This park bench became the key to 5 disappearances. In many archived reports tied to a quiet suburban trail, one park bench kept showing up in every witness statement. The bench sat beside an older walking path that locals used for years, and it became the center of a strange pattern tied to 5 missing people. The story followed a 34-year-old technician named Braden Lyle, who lived a few miles from the park. He worked maintenance shifts at a small distribution center, and he often stopped by the trail after long nights on the floor. He used the spot to unwind and clear his head before heading home. His goal that morning in early autumn of 2021 was simple. He planned to sit for a few minutes and send a short message to his sister who had been asking about a ride the following weekend. Braden parked near the first turnoff, and he walked toward the bench while thinking about breakfast. The path was empty that morning, and the air felt colder than it usually did. He reached the bench, and he set his bag down while noticing fresh flowers near the base. He had seen flowers there before, but usually only 1 or 2. That morning, he counted 3 bunches, and each looked recently placed. He sat and opened his phone, and that was when he heard a faint snap behind him. He turned, but saw no one on the path. He listened for a moment, and he heard what sounded like quiet breathing near the small cluster of trees. He stood and called out a simple greeting, and he waited without moving. The breathing faded, and he felt uneasy enough to step back from the bench. A woman approached from the trail side and asked if he had heard something by the trees. Her name was Maren Ulrich, a 31-year-old caseworker who visited the trail on her days off. She pointed toward the bench and said she had seen a man sitting there 2 days earlier who vanished after dropping a small notebook. Braden asked what she meant by vanished. She explained that the man had walked toward the trees, and no one saw him leave the area based on her follow-up checks. Braden felt a chill and picked up his bag, and he asked if she had looked around for the notebook. She nodded and said she had found it under the bench. She kept it at home after failing to find a name inside. She told him she could bring it later if he wanted to see it, and he agreed since the story bothered him. She said she would return in an hour after finishing her walk. Braden stayed near the bench and looked around the clearing while replaying her account. The flowers suddenly felt more significant, and he remembered a local post from late 2020 that mentioned a missing runner who often paused near that same bench. He opened an archived article on his phone and saw a blurred photo of the bench with a date stamp. His stomach tightened when he noticed the same pattern of flowers near the legs. He walked closer to the tree line and saw a strip of cloth caught on a branch. He reached up and pulled it free, and he noticed faint mud streaks along the fabric. He placed it on the bench and took a photo for his own record. He had done informal volunteer searches before, and he knew documenting small clues mattered when nothing else made sense. A man in his late 50s entered the clearing and stopped near the bench. He introduced himself as Arvin Drexler, a retired surveyor who lived across the road from the trail. He asked if Braden was looking into the disappearances tied to the area. Braden said he was only trying to understand what happened near the bench. Arvin nodded and said he had seen similar details across several years, and each case started with someone stopping to rest. Arvin pointed to a narrow gap in the trees where old markers hung from metal hooks. He said the markers were part of an abandoned drainage project from the early 2010s. He explained that the project left several deep maintenance pits that were never fully filled, and he believed people may have fallen into an access point hidden under thick brush. Braden asked if he ever reported that theory. Arvin said he tried, but no one followed up due to limited staff and unclear evidence. Marin returned with the notebook in her hand, and she gave it to Braden. The cover felt worn, and several pages had faint impressions of older notes. He flipped through and found a short line written on the last page. It said, "Met them again by the bench after nightfall." The handwriting looked shaky, and the ink appeared fresh compared to the other pages. Braden asked where exactly she found it. She said it had been wedged between two boards under the far side of the bench. Arvin leaned closer and said he had never seen anyone place a notebook there, which made him think the writer returned recently. Braden felt the temperature shift and noticed a faint draft coming from the gap in the trees. He walked toward the marked area and pushed aside thick branches. Beneath the fallen brush, he found a concrete lip with rusted bolts. The ground dipped sharply, and a hollow space opened several feet below. He knelt and used his phone light to check for movement. He saw only old tools and a broken ladder, yet something about the depth made his pulse race. He called out to ask if anyone was down there. No one answered, but a weak echo carried the sound back. Marin suggested checking the other side of the pit for a safer angle. They circled the clearing, and Arvin pointed to a collapsed section of fencing that partially covered another opening. Braden cleared some branches, and he spotted a shoe near the edge. The rubber looked worn, and the sole pattern matched a detail from the runner case he had read earlier. He carefully reached for it, and he noticed dry mud around the heel. Braden asked Arvin to hold his phone while he photographed the shoe. Marin stepped back to avoid disturbing the area, and she scanned the surrounding branches for more fabric. She pointed to another strip caught on a higher limb, which matched the cloth Braden found earlier. They connected the pieces and realized someone had likely moved through the gap with enough force to tear clothing. Braden called a non-emergency line and reported the discovery. He gave general details without naming the notebook and said he believed an old maintenance pit posed danger to visitors. A dispatcher said someone would check the site later, though no estimate was given. That answer frustrated Braden, and he decided to take additional photos to support the claim. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the flowers again and realized each bunch marked dates close to older missing person reports. He photographed the flowers and compared their spacing to the article images. The match felt close enough to suggest someone used the bench as a memorial or a signal. Marin suggested the writer of the notebook might have met someone connected to those flowers, and the line about meeting them again could imply repeated encounters. Braden opened the notebook once more and touched the last page. He noticed tiny indent marks above the line that hinted at a torn message. He angled the page toward the light and saw faint shapes. It looked like someone had written a location reference before removing the sheet. He took a close photo, planning to use editing tools later to enhance the impressions. They decided to walk the perimeter of the clearing before leaving, and Arvin guided them to an older fire road behind the benches. The road had cracked pavement and faded tape lines. He said he once saw a person wearing a reflective vest walking that area at night during 2018. He never identified the person, but he remembered the pattern on the vest matched old county uniforms that were discontinued years earlier. Braden connected that detail to the notebook entry and wondered if the writer had followed someone who claimed to inspect the trail. Marin said the county stopped sending inspectors to that area due to limited funding, which made the sighting even stranger. Arvin agreed and said the person may have used an old uniform to avoid suspicion. They returned to the bench, and Braden looked at the wooden boards where the notebook had been found. He noticed scrape marks near the underside. He slid a hand under the frame and found a small metal clip. It felt loose, and he pulled gently. A folded paper slipped out and landed on the ground. He unfolded it and read a short handwritten note that said, "Follow the lights near the cutoff after dark." The writing matched the notebook. Marin covered her mouth and said the message made her think someone used small lights to guide visitors toward the maintenance pit. Arvin said he once saw flickering lights near the cutoff during late 2019, but assumed they were kids playing with flashlights. Braden realized the lights may have lured curious people toward the gap. They stood silently as the idea settled. The disappearances could have been accidents caused by a hidden pit and a misleading light source. The writer of the notebook may have followed the lights and nearly fell or witnessed someone else fall. Braden suggested the writer tore out the earlier page to give it to someone, possibly a friend or an officer, yet the person never turned it in. A faint gust moved through the clearing, and Braden felt uneasy again. He gathered the notebook and folded note, and he said he would deliver them to the local station as soon as possible. Marin said she would provide her statement about seeing the notebook drop 2 days earlier. Arvin agreed to guide officers to the pit if needed. They walked back toward the parking area while discussing safer trail access. Braden looked over his shoulder at the bench, and he felt a strange pull. The bench had been a quiet place for years, yet its role in 5 disappearances seemed tied to simple mistakes, hidden hazards, and poorly understood signals left by an unknown person. The truth felt less like a supernatural mystery and more like a chain of overlooked warnings. Braden left the park with a steady resolve to push for a full inspection. He believed the answers were already there in the bench, in the flowers, and in the fragments of notes hidden under old boards. The truth only needed patient eyes to connect what had been ignored, and he hoped the next visitor would find the trail safer once those connections reached the right people. The stories. What a night janitor found behind the vending machine. Roughly 10 years ago, a late shift incident at a small distribution center led to a report that never reached public records. The file described something a night janitor found behind a vending machine after a quiet shift turned strange. Rylan Cho worked nights at a regional packing warehouse on the edge of a mid-sized town. He was 37 and had been there almost 7 years. He liked the silence after midnight and usually finished his route with music in his earbuds. On this particular night in late spring of 2014, he wanted to clock out early and get home before a storm hit the valley. He started in the loading bay with a simple goal for the night: finish his checklist, empty the bins, and mop the narrow hallway near the break room before the wind picked up outside. The building felt colder than usual, and the air system made a steady hum that covered most small sounds. The incident began around 1:30 in the morning when Rylan passed the break room and saw the vending machine screen flick on by itself. The machine had been glitchy before, so he did not think much of it until he noticed the light did not show the usual bright menu. Instead, it looked dim with a strange gray shimmer moving across the glass. A soft tapping sound came from behind the machine. Rylan stepped closer and asked out loud if someone was stuck. He expected no reply. The tapping repeated 2 times with steady rhythm. He backed up a little and checked the doorway leading to the maintenance hall. No one else should have been there since the last forklift crew left hours earlier. He went to find the shift supervisor, but realized he was alone for the next hour since the supervisor had gone to the far lot to handle a truck issue. Rylan returned to the break room and watched the machine again. The shimmer on the screen grew lighter, then faded. He unplugged the power cord to reset it, and the tapping stopped. When he pushed the machine slightly, he felt something resist from behind. The machine sat tight against the wall with no gap. He moved it a few inches and saw a narrow, dark space behind the right side panel. Something metallic glinted inside the space. Rylan grabbed his small work light from the janitor cart and angled the beam toward the opening. A metal box covered with dust sat wedged between the drywall and the machine frame. The box looked old. The lid had a faded sticker with part of a name scratched off. He reached in and pulled it free. Inside were 3 items: a small bound notebook, a thin plastic badge with a photo rubbed almost blank, and an audio recorder the size of a deck of cards. The notebook smelled musty. The first page held uneven handwriting, saying property of Hale Dorn, who worked maintenance from 2003 to 2008 based on a short training archive. Rylan later checked. Rylan remembered hearing from older staff that Hale left suddenly after a safety investigation. Nothing official remained in the shared files. Most said he moved away. A few said he had filed complaints about strange vibrations near the break room wall. Rylan opened the notebook carefully. The first entry from early 2006 described recurring knocking sounds near the vending machine as well as faint static pulses in the wall during night shifts. Hale wrote that he made several unofficial recordings, but none stayed consistent when reviewed later. The next entries grew more detailed. Hale noted timestamps, short sketches of sound waves, and small maps of the hallway layout. One entry from late 2006 described a night when the machine screen flickered with a gray wash, similar to what Rylan had seen hours earlier. Hale wrote that the tapping seemed to follow his movements around the room. Rylan turned to the last written page dated mid-2007. It read, "I need to get someone to check the wiring before this gets worse." The lines after that looked rushed. Hale wrote that he found a small access hole behind the machine with a narrow duct running into the maintenance room. He believed air pressure changes inside the duct caused some of the sounds. The next note stated, "I still hear something moving in there, although the duct should be empty." Rylan set the notebook down and inspected the audio recorder. It contained a small tape with a handwritten label that read Night Shift Sample 2. He slipped it into his pocket with the plan to listen later under better light. He then checked the badge. The image showed Hale with short hair and tired eyes. The back listed his role as maintenance support. Rylan pushed the machine farther from the wall to look for the duct mentioned in the notes. A narrow circular opening near the baseboard revealed an old service channel that ran behind several rooms. It had not been used in years based on the dust and cobwebs. The channel connected to the maintenance room and likely carried air back when the building used a different system. He crouched closer and felt a cool draft from deep inside the channel. The draft moved in a steady pulse instead of a constant stream. When he leaned nearer, he heard a faint scrape followed by two soft taps. He jumped back and called out if anyone was inside. No reply followed. Rylan stood still and waited for another sound. 3 minutes passed quietly. He reached into the opening with the work light and shined the beam across the first few feet. Dust floated in the narrow space and nothing moved. The scrape sound did not repeat. He repositioned the vending machine and photographed the channel opening so he could show the supervisor. He then finished his route feeling uneasy. When his shift ended at 3, he took the notebook and recorder home. Later that afternoon, he listened to the tape. It began with low background hum, likely from the old air system. 30 seconds in, a rhythmic tapping started. It matched the pattern Rylan heard earlier. The tapping repeated 4 times, then stopped. Hale's voice spoke quietly, saying, "I know the duct is empty, yet it keeps making that pattern." The tape ended with a short static burst. Rylan cross-checked the tape with archived maintenance logs from 2006 available through an internal server. He found a note about air pressure complaints near the break room, but no follow-up reports. The log mentioned Hale's concern about a possible leak inside the service channel and recommended an inspection that never occurred. Rylan met with the supervisor the next night and showed the findings. The supervisor listened to part of the tape and agreed that the sound pattern matched what past crews mentioned during older shifts. He filed a report to the facilities manager, who arranged a full inspection later that week. The inspection team removed the vending machine and opened the service channel. They found a partially detached metal flap deep inside that moved when the air system cycled. The flap created repeated taps during pressure changes, which explained the pattern recorded by Hale. Inspectors also found old tools left behind by a previous contractor, which caused the scrape Rylan heard. The team sealed the channel, repaired the flap, and recommended replacing the vending machine wiring due to aging components that caused the strange screen flicker reported by both Hale and Rylan. 2 weeks later, the warehouse returned to normal. The tapping never came back. The recording was archived inside a general maintenance file, and the notebook was stored with other historical documents kept for internal reference. Rylan kept thinking about how one small discovery behind a vending machine connected him to someone who tried to document the same odd sounds years earlier. He believed Hale had tried to solve a problem that no one else seemed to notice until the notes surfaced again. The story lives quietly inside a handful of reports, and one old tape that proves how simple overlooked issues can create experiences that feel much stranger than they are, especially during long nights when empty hallways amplify every sound. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice, asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town. and he saw a faint glow near the rocks as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log discovered months later matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believed the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker, the nurse who refused to enter room 6 again. Lila Farnes first heard about room 6 through a short entry in an old staffing report that mentioned unusual overnight disruptions. The report was dated to 2009 and came from a small regional clinic that sat outside a quiet town with limited medical resources. Lila was 33 and worked as a traveling nurse who filled short contracts in understaffed facilities. She arrived at the clinic during early autumn when the halls felt calm and the night shift moved slowly through predictable routines. Her simple goal that week was to keep a steady rhythm while saving money for a move planned for the next spring. On her second night, she was assigned a rotation that included room 6, which held a recovering patient named Dorian Pike. He was 62 with a mild respiratory issue that required observation but posed no immediate danger. His chart suggested stable progress, which meant the room should have been an easy stop during her quiet rounds. The incident began when Lila stepped inside the room and noticed a faint tapping sound that seemed to come from the wall near the bed. The patient had been awake, and he watched her with an uneasy expression that suggested he wanted to speak, but hesitated. She asked if he needed anything, and he answered with a flat, "Please keep the lights on tonight," which struck her as odd, given his preference for darkness noted earlier by the day nurse. During her next pass, the tapping returned and felt sharper, like something struck the wall with steady intent. Lila checked the hallway and found nothing unusual beyond a supply cart resting near a closed door. She reviewed maintenance notes later and saw that workers had previously inspected the wall after a similar complaint in 2006, yet found no loose utilities or structural issues. The complication deepened when a nurse on the shift before hers mentioned archived calls made by former night staff. Those calls reportedly described patient distress related to sudden cold drafts that moved through room 6 even when vents were shut. Lila filed this in her mind, but kept her focus on what she could directly verify, which meant returning to the room with a calm approach and simple checks. When she entered again, she saw Dorian clutching the call button with both hands and staring at the same wall that had produced the tapping. He whispered, "They move through here," which confused her because he had no history of disorientation and his oxygen levels looked normal. She tried reassuring him, but he pointed toward a small framed print that hung crooked like someone had pushed it earlier. Lila documented the scene, then stepped into the hallway to compare notes with the evening charge nurse named Brenton Shaw. He was in his late 40s and had worked the clinic for many years, which gave him perspective on long-standing issues. Brenton admitted that room 6 had frequent incident logs related to unexplained noise, but he never saw anything dangerous, so he kept assignments unchanged. The investigation began after Dorian reported that someone had touched his arm during a period when no staff had entered the room. Lila checked the security panel near the nurse's station, which showed timestamps for door openings captured by the badge sensor. The logs indicated her previous visit, followed by a long gap with no recorded entry, which made his claim puzzling. She then reviewed older patient notes from 2003 to 2008, which described brief episodes of agitation from individuals with no history of anxiety. Several mentioned hearing movement behind the wall near the bed, and one wrote that a picture frame had tilted during a quiet stretch. These details were small but consistent, which encouraged her to look for a physical explanation. Lila asked the maintenance lead named Corbin Rusk to inspect the wall after her shift ended. He brought a handheld thermal scanner and ran it across the surface while she watched from the doorway. The tool showed a thin vertical band of cooler temperature that did not match the building layout, which suggested an unregistered cavity or narrow chase behind the drywall. Corbin returned during daylight with a small borescope camera designed to look behind tight spaces. He located a hidden seam in the corner that had been painted over during earlier renovations. When he guided the camera inside, they saw a slender gap between structural supports where unsecured pipes ran without proper insulation, which explained both the cold drafts and the intermittent tapping. The twist emerged when Corbin followed the pipes farther and discovered that the cavity connected to an abandoned service chase sealed decades earlier, according to archived renovation notes. That chase once linked several rooms, including room 6, where older patients had repeatedly complained about footsteps at night. The noise likely traveled along the hollow space and grew sharper as the building shifted during temperature changes. Lila returned to Dorian with the findings, which eased his fear because it gave something concrete to replace earlier uncertainty. She watched him relax when she explained how air moved through the gap and how small vibrations struck the wall during normal settling. He nodded and said, "That makes more sense than what I thought," which helped restore predictable routines for the rest of his stay. The payoff became clear a few days later when the clinic sealed the gap with proper insulation, which stopped the tapping that had bothered so many night staff over the years. Lila felt relieved because the solution fit every clue she had gathered from logs, witness comments, and earlier maintenance records. She no longer feared the room and worked her shifts without hesitation. Still, she remembered the moment she first stepped into room 6 and sensed tension that felt older than her short assignment. She knew many stories deepen when fearful people misread unfamiliar sounds, but she also understood how convincing those moments can feel. Later, she often said that small mysteries usually shrink under steady checking and clear evidence, which matched her experience at the clinic. Lila finished her contract without further issues and moved to her next job carrying a quiet confidence shaped by those nights. She still thought about Dorian and the relief in his voice after learning the real cause behind the unsettling moments. Room 6 stayed sealed and silent after the repairs, which meant future patients would sleep without wondering what moved behind the wall.